In too much. Good afternoon. My name is Carol McCoy. I work for Stantec Consulting Services. Stantec is a global professional services consulting firm, and we do renewables work around the globe, here in the Midwest, and especially here in Wisconsin, of course. So it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to Kari Lydersen, who's our featured speaker. Kari is an author, a photographer, and a teacher. She's a staff writer for Energy News Network, focused there on projects in Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. Kari's also a professor, or I should say a teacher, at Northwestern University, where she works within the School of Journalism, leading the social justice and investigative specialization program there. Kari is an author of several books. One of them is entitled Closing the Cloud Factories. That book is all about the fight to close coal plants in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Kari Lydersen.
All right, well, thanks for having me here. I live in Chicago, and I really like Wisconsin, and I love reporting on Wisconsin and getting any chance to come up here. So yeah, I'd like to talk today about my home state, Illinois, and Wisconsin, and specifically about the clean energy shift and the equity and just transition aspects of that shift in both states. And I have covered among other things, the third-party solar debate in Wisconsin. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I think everyone's probably really familiar with those issues. And then also just a little bit about the transition away from coal and the legacy of coal, which of course is crucial to the whole clean energy transition. So this works. If you, especially if you're in the solar industry, you probably know that Illinois has passed two big energy bills within the past 5 years. The first bill passed in 2016 was the Future Energy Jobs Act, or Fija, and that was really hailed as a landmark clean energy bill, one of the most ambitious in the country, and took several years of difficult negotiations leading up to it. Fija did include a pretty robust and ambitious equity component, and that's one of the things in my own work I really focus on. So I've been actually really excited and interested today to hear about all the focus on equity and environmental justice from the Lieutenant Governor and other speakers as well. So Fija was, among other things, meant to vastly expand the capacity of distributed solar and renewables in general in Illinois, and to make sure that the benefit of that clean energy transition goes in part to the communities that are hardest hit by the fossil fuel economy, and help those people benefit from solar installations and also jobs in solar and in the clean energy economy in general. And with some novel things about Fija, it prioritized those environmental justice communities. It had specific priorities placed on training and jobs for alumni of the foster care system and citizens returning from the criminal justice system, big issues, especially in Chicago. And one of the things that I found really interesting about covering the debate around Fija was the relationship between the grassroots community groups that are such a big part of Chicago's landscape and the quote unquote big green organizations, the larger NGOs and environmental organizations. And the book that I did about the closing of Chicago's coal plants, that was actually a major theme of that book. So the coal plants in Chicago closed in 2012, and community groups, in particular two called the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization and the Pilsen Alliance, had actually been pushing for the closure of these coal plants, which are both in these two largely Mexican immigrant working class neighborhoods right next to each other. I live in one of them in Pilsen. These groups have been pushing for the closure of these coal plants since at least the turn of the millennium. And then about a decade later, those coal plants became actually an international symbol of the fight against coal and the transition away from coal. So there were some pretty interesting dynamics and negotiations, and it was really fascinating and impressive to see the hard work on all sides from the staff of the larger environmental organizations and these grassroots leaders trying to work together and understand each other and really develop a collaboration that was in many ways often kind of tense and fraught, but ended up being very productive. So after that, those coal plants closed in 2012. That coalition sort of turned their focus to relatively briefly getting community choice aggregation in Illinois. That sort of fizzled out, a whole other story, but then those groups ended up working together on Fija, and it really did get this pretty landmark legislation passed. And that Fija passed while we had, of course, the Democratic legislature in Illinois, led by then no longer Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan, and the legislation was signed by Governor Bruce Rauner. So we did, at the time have the inverse of what you all have here in Wisconsin, with the governor being from a different party than the legislature. And I know people are, it sounds like a little bit pessimistic about the possibility for really sweeping energy legislation here in Wisconsin, or it sounds like it's been difficult in many ways and will continue to be. No different in Illinois, maybe different dynamics, but we'd had, especially during this previous era when Fija was passed, the legislature was infamous for deadlocks on everything from workers' compensation to the budget. We went a long time without a budget at all because it was so difficult for the legislature to get anything done. So the fact that this energy bill passed and was signed was really pretty incredible. And one part of it that was crucial to the passage was it did include big subsidies for Exelon for their nuclear plants. And that was a controversial thing. A lot of people referred to that as a bailout. There was a lot of debate over whether the subsidy was really needed for Exelon to keep those plants open, but that probably was essential to it passing, having this big, powerful company pushing for it. So this slide here, the legislation did pass. It did create a real solar boom in Illinois, especially in distributed solar, which was the intent. It created the right to sell RECs that really fuel just a massive demand for residential and commercial, and especially even community solar in large and small categories. In 2017, the first year the law took effect, there'd been 17 megawatts or 18 megawatts or so installed. And in 2019, just for example, under the law, there was more than 100 megawatts installed. And just over those couple years, the total solar capacity increased about threefold, and really driven by utility scale solar was incentivized by Fija also, but the focus was really on the distributed solar generation. But there were also problems, as I know, at least some people here worked on directly and had I'm sure a lot of fun hashing out the demand for the RECs. The program was actually even more popular maybe than predicted. So just the wild demand for the RECs, especially in the community solar category, created a lot of bottlenecks and chaos in the actual awarding process and the interconnection process, and just getting this all rolled out. And the money essentially ran out more quickly than expected. And developers, all these national solar companies had flocked to Illinois. Local companies started up, local companies that already existed, hired more staff, really optimistic, positive atmosphere. But before you know it, this slide is one example of some of the solar teams. But before you know it, this solar cliff was looming, where it was clear that the incentives were going to run out. And without new legislation, this industry that was just starting to boom was really facing a bust. Meanwhile, the equity component also didn't really go as smoothly as might have been hoped. It was just really hard, probably not surprisingly, really hard to do the outreach and to drum up the interest and participation in a lot of communities that the equity program was meant to target. Just by definition, a lot of those marginalized communities and people struggling economically had so many other challenges and stresses in their lives that learning about solar and getting solar panels or getting trained for a solar job just wasn't high on the list of priorities. And And this is a slide from the Illinois Solar for All program. And a lot of really hard work was done to try to promote that program. And there were definitely some successes, but again, slower rollout and less participation than would have been hoped. And really great attempts, and in some cases successes, to really work with communities on the ground is necessary, but that's a really, really hard task. So still a lot of untapped potential on the equity front under Fija. And then the solar cliff did materialize. The incentives in most of those programs for the distributed solar incentives, that funding did run out, and the timing was especially bad right during the pandemic when the solar industry was stalled. The distributed residential commercial solar industry really stalled anyway because of the pandemic. So real crisis for a lot of local and national solar companies doing business in Illinois. And some solar developers I talked to wondered if they would survive at all, if they would just change professions entirely. A lot of layoffs. And by this time, debate over a new bill was already in full swing. This bill, if it's possible, was even more complicated and often contentious debate and negotiations than Fija. This bill was aiming to be even more sweeping, more ambitious in terms of restarting the solar economy and increasing clean energy targets and really getting to zero carbon emissions and having an even more ambitious and actually successful equity and just transition part of it. And again, Exelon wanted more subsidies for nuclear plants that had not gotten subsidies in the first go round. So they were back at the table. Initially, Exelon was allied with some of the community and environmental groups that had really shepherded Fija, and also with some of the labor unions. So that was for some of the groups, uncomfortable coalition. And then the big scandal broke with what ended up being federal indictments for bribery and conspiracy related charges with ComEd and Exelon, the parent company, the Exelon Utilities CEO resigning, all this swirling around the office of then House Speaker Mike Madigan. So really big story in Illinois for a long time that blew up right during the negotiations over this second energy bill. So the community and environmental groups basically decided that they would not work with utilities directly on this bill. So that coalition was fractured. And meanwhile, renewable energy developers split off and had their own coalition. So their coalition was called the Path to 100. And then the community environmental groups were the Clean Energy Jobs Coalition, or the Clean Energy Jobs Coalition. Pushing for the Clean Energy Jobs Act was the bill that they had worked on. So negotiations between these, former allies got pretty bitter as well, debate over the funding mechanism. And to really oversimplify it, but kind of boil it down, the community and environmental groups were pushing for a much more ambitious bill, really heavy and detailed on the equity and just transition components. And I think the solar industry just felt so desperate to get something passed that this is my interpretation, but it seemed like they wanted a leaner bill that could just pass more quickly and more realistically. And also debate over the funding, whether capacity market reforms would be a valid way to fund it or not, which one of the coalitions wanted. So that bill, and by this time, Governor J.B. Pritzker was governor, a Democrat, and he came out really strongly in support of a clean energy bill. He made that a priority, so that was a big help. But even then, it was far from a done deal. At the meantime, labor unions had also come forward with their own coalition, who had their own draft bill and priorities, and not surprisingly wanted prevailing wage and different labor protections as intrinsic to the bill, and also had sort of an alliance with ComEd that was complicated. And organized labor, of course, in Illinois is a huge force to be reckoned with. And some of the things that the labor coalition wanted would be really difficult for the renewables industry, especially solar developers, I think. So that threw another wrench in things. eventually, in the summer, it looked like passage and signing of a bill was imminent. And then at the last minute, opposition from natural gas backers of natural gas plants and Prairie State, this huge coal plant in Illinois with a really troubled, complicated history. They raised opposition over the phasing out of fossil fuels by 2045. Meanwhile, environmentalists wanted Prairie State to actually have to ratchet their emissions down sooner than that. So it took another couple months before the bill was finally signed in September of this past year, 2021. Again, all negotiated during the pandemic, adding even more drama to the whole thing. So it did have another $700 million in subsidies for Exelon's nuclear plants for 2 of them. And it did jumpstart renewables, especially the distributed solar industry. There were about $340 million for subsidies for renewable energy or supports, and $180 million for the just transition component for helping communities where fossil fuel and nuclear plants would close, helping them survive that economic impact. And then it's important to note that that's a little premature. The previous bill, even though there was this solar boom, utility scale solar still, or utility scale renewables in general, were still really lagging behind what would have been necessary to meet Illinois' renewable portfolio standard and clean energy targets. So the focus, at least in the kind of public debate, the focus on utility scale renewables got sort of overshadowed during those Fija years. And the Illinois Power Agency, which procures power on behalf of the utilities, was trying to sound the alarm that no matter how the distributed solar part goes, we're just not going to meet our renewable goals unless there's more utility scale renewables. So that's something that there's new procurement started, and something that hopefully will be fixed under the new bill as well. So yeah, the equity components, I know something that people in Wisconsin are really interested in. A whole ambitious suite of things are included in the bill that was passed, the Climate Equitable Jobs Act. There's clean energy workforce training hubs, again, with different priorities and carve outs for people from different types of environmental justice and marginalized backgrounds. There's the Illinois Solar for All program to actually help people in places who've been left out of the clean energy and fossil fuel economy, to help them actually get solar, benefit from solar. And then aside from that, a big electric vehicle program to get 1 million electric vehicles on the road, and energy efficiency, and a lot of other good things in that bill too. So by this fall, solar companies were starting to feel hopeful again and really getting ready to hash out the details. There was sort of an emergency round of RECs made available to jumpstart things quickly. And then still the details of how the REC program will be administered are still being figured out, and trying to learn from lessons from the difficulties under Fija. And then this just transition component is pretty hopeful. There's funding, scholarships, job training, mandated advance notice for plant closures, various things in there, a program to put solar and storage on the site of coal plants. I'm a little skeptical about how that's actually going to work out, but a good idea in theory. And the just transition movement in Illinois, I'd like to learn more about this movement in Wisconsin. In Illinois, it's been a pretty vibrant movement for quite some time. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about it is there's a lot of it going on in Chicago, but it's really centered in downstate Illinois, where a lot of the coal plants and coal mines, we have the coal mines too, where they are. And then there's also an exciting outpost of just transition activism in Waukegan in northern Illinois, where NRG's coal plant is going to close in coming years. And the largely Latinx young activists and residents there have really been clamoring for just transition promises for a while, and pressing NRG and the government, and some of them are in the government, on what they're going to do. So yeah, I feel like Illinois is always in an interesting place, good or bad. I think is in hopefully a good place as far as clean energy and equity and just transition goes. Some of the kind of lessons or comparisons I wanted to mention related to Wisconsin. I I did mention how utility scale solar, ultimately proved to be really crucial to actually meeting clean energy goals. I guess, no big surprise there, but comparing Illinois to Wisconsin, where Illinois has had all this success with utility scale solar, but lagging on the distributed solar front is an interesting thing to drill down on. But I do feel like distributed solar, both in terms more so than the actual capacity, is just so symbolic and important in really having a clean energy shift, just helping people experience solar directly and feel like they can be part of it and they can benefit from it and understand it. Just the symbolic and educational value is so great. And actual energy savings if people are able to access energy savings from distributed solar. And that's, of course, in Wisconsin, where third-party solar and community solar legislation would be so important. And then I'd be curious to understand more kind of the different potentials and pitfalls of sweeping energy legislation like Illinois had, or clean energy plans under executive orders or otherwise like Wisconsin's working on, pros and cons of both, what you can do with some and not the other. As I mentioned before, the bill in Illinois, or the law, is now really, a lot of great things in there. Also came with these compromises and such a long, difficult process. And I think that ComEd scandal was actually a blessing in disguise for the bill too, because that added extra political impetus to get it done, because people were demanding ethics reforms and dealing with these formula rates that ComEd had sort of disingenuously pushed through in the past. So, that Exelon's demand for subsidies and just this political furor actually was crucial to getting the Illinois legislation passed, I think. So, yeah, to talk a little bit about Wisconsin, and you all know Wisconsin better than me, but I've really enjoyed hearing the talks today and in the past, learning from Renew and Cub and Clean Wisconsin and people here who've really taken the time to explain your state to me. Obviously, the deregulated environment in Illinois versus regulated in Wisconsin is a really big difference. And I would think in some ways that the regulated structure might make some of these things actually easier, maybe. And then, of course, things like the community solar and third-party owned solar just aren't even really a problem or an issue in Illinois, because those just fit with the idea that generation is owned privately and separately from the utilities. So yeah, I know utility scale solar has really been doing pretty great in Wisconsin. New announcements about utility scale projects, all the things we've been hearing about today. So that seems like something maybe Illinois can learn from. Just going by SIA statistics, Wisconsin, it says, has 625 megawatts of solar capacity, with these huge jumps in 20 and 21, and the vast majority of that being in utility scale. So Illinois also, by CEJA figures, has 1,000 megawatts, although actually getting a little bit less of its total power from solar, but both still under 1%. So obviously still a pretty small portion. But you can see here how Illinois, how there's so much emphasis on distributed solar and community solar in Illinois as compared to utility scale, obviously considering the economies of scale. So yeah, it is really, I've covered this third-party solar battle in Wisconsin for a long time, and pretty interesting. I think you probably all know all about it, but just in case anyone doesn't, the real basics, as I think you all know, it really kicked into motion with Milwaukee's plan to do the megawatt of solar on 6 city buildings with Eagle Point Solar, and then We Energy's refusing to interconnect those and saying that Eagle Point would be acting like a utility. And I won't even explain what third-party owned solar is, because I think everyone knows that well, but obviously a really important thing to allow nonprofits to access solar, and even people who do pay taxes, entities that do pay taxes, taking out the risk and the upfront investment. And making it, again, accessible. Illinois, we had those RECs, which really helped, but without the RECs and without without third-party ownership. I can see how there would be huge barriers to lots of entities here who want to do it. So yeah, and I know I'd covered in the past We Energy's so-called Rent a Roof program. So, I know they're offering that as their alternative to third-party owned solar, but I know critics of that see it as not really benefiting the customer and as a pretty pale offering. And it does seem like if that program was really great, they shouldn't feel so threatened by third-party ownership, because someone could choose whether they want to do Rent a Roof or do their own third-party owned installation. And it is worth noting, I mean, it's a totally different situation with the utilities in Illinois, but ComEd has in past legislation tried to sort of wedge themselves into being solar providers, and were essentially shot down in those efforts. So even though the situation is different, it's not a totally foreign situation to Illinois. So I thought it's the two third-party ownership bills that have been introduced here, the one that would explicitly make third-party ownership legal, and then the community solar one, which is essentially a third-party ownership bill as well. I'd covered those over the past year, and I thought I do still think the bipartisan nature of those and the Republican conservative leadership is so important. And I mean, it's obviously in a state like Wisconsin, that is been kind of a symbol of polarization and of tricky politics in the past two presidential elections and beyond. That just really, really seems crucial. It was disappointing to hear earlier that those bills aren't really moving, but I assume are still alive, and people are still hopeful that those will pass, especially the community solar bill. I mean, Illinois, you can't overstate the voracious interest in community solar that's been created by those laws, especially with the incentives, but really just the desire that all kinds of regular people and institutions have for community solar. And then the environmental justice and just transition aspect, which I would be really curious to learn more about that in Wisconsin, and would love to follow up with anyone here on that front. I have seen both how important and interesting, and also, as I mentioned, difficult that's been in Illinois. And I know Milwaukee, as you guys know well, has plenty of social justice and racial justice issues, and other cities in the state as a whole too. Chicago, is kind of famous for being the birthplace of community organizing, and has so many really powerful, really well organized, longstanding community groups. I know Milwaukee has many of those too, but probably maybe nowhere in the country has as robust of a community organizing landscape as Chicago. And nonetheless, it's been so hard to really have clean energy equity in Chicago. So I can only imagine that it's going to be a big challenge here and anywhere. And will really, it is requiring and will really require just deep investment of time and resources, and truly, people truly coming to the table together and breaking down power dynamics and privilege and all those things that make these conversations and these efforts so difficult. And I know Renew has made equity a priority for a long time with the Solar for Good program and other efforts. And it was really just great to hear today about all the emphasis on climate justice and clean energy equity. In the past, I've been lucky to spend a little time with the Wisconsin Green Muslims and with Huda Alkaf, who I saw just recently got the Catalyst Award from Rachel's Network for Women of Color, carrying on Rachel Carson's legacy. See if I can get a slide up. Oops, jumping ahead a little. There's one event I was at with Huda. So yeah, I was going to talk a little bit more about coal. I'll kind of skip through that, but I'm happy to talk about coal anytime if anyone wants to. One thing I will mention with the students I've been working at Northwestern, we're doing over the course of about 6 months a really in-depth investigation related to coal ash and this legacy of coal that will continue to be a problem in Illinois and Wisconsin and states all over the country for decades to come. And then obviously, so that's one thing we'll have to deal with as the clean energy shift is made. That's the Oak Creek collapse of from 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And then I know CUB and other groups have been working on the issue of stranded coal plant costs, which is at least something we don't really deal with in Illinois, except for maybe with Prairie State, which has this crazy deal where municipalities are essentially own its debt. But yeah, so I know CUB and others are pushing for securitization where the debt from the coal plants can be reduced through low interest bonds and ideally reduce the amount that ratepayers have to keep paying for these coal plants, even at the same time that they're paying for renewable energy that's being built. But I know securitization can be done in a way that doesn't necessarily benefit ratepayers. So that's something that watchdogs in other states too are keeping an eye on to make sure that if securitization is done, it actually helps ratepayers. And there's even deeper things that can be done with investing some of the revenue from bonds and retraining programs and just transition components for communities where the coal plants close. So yeah, thanks for listening to my thoughts and letting me talk about Illinois. And I'd be curious if anyone has comments or story ideas on any of the things I brought up or questions. So, thank you. Feel free to reach out to me. That's my contact information up there. Yeah.
Pardon me. I just had a quick question. For those of us relatively new to the state, could you give us a quick overview of what the community solar bill looks like its structure? Are we talking about retail rate bill credits? Is it applicable to all utilities? I was interested to hear at the lunch session also the talk of the social cost of carbon and whether that's going to be tied into that at all. Anything you know about, just give me a quick overview of that.
Yeah, I mean the real specifics, someone else would be better than me, including the sponsors or the groups here that are working on it. On just the very most basic level, as you probably know, it would allow community solar to be built by entities other than the utilities, which is essentially third-party ownership. And I'm pretty sure the bill text actually refers to third-party ownership of community solar. So making it clear that that is legal. And if I understand right, that's actually maybe a little bit more important and concrete of an argument or necessary of an argument for community solar, where you do have multiple subscribers, as opposed to clarifying that third-party ownership on my roof where the panels are owned by someone else. That's clearly already legal, but they just want clarification of that. I guess I can see how the community solar bill is maybe a harder, but also a more important, this is just my understanding, but also a more important thing to get through, since there are actually more people or more entities getting that power. But yeah, I'm sure others here can give you more. And the social cost of carbon, I don't know if that would really be in the bill in any way, but obviously just one of the reasons that we need all these bills to decarbonize the economy.
I have two questions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, one of them has to do with NIMBYism. I noticed you had the utilities putting up 500 megawatts last year. So that must mean there's huge arrays somewhere. I mean, we're having a big problem with NIMBYism on solar farms here in Wisconsin. I'm wondering, is there anything we can learn from Illinois? And was there anything like that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We just have actually fewer solar farms in Illinois, and it's also, I think bigger stretches of vast farmland where they're not as close to people. So I don't think, there's isolated incidents here and there, and there's been in the past some activists that have sort of gone town to town in Illinois, trying to drum up opposition more so to wind, but also to solar. So we've definitely had a little bit of that. But I think you're probably getting more of it here in Wisconsin, just since your land is different and there's more people that live closer to the solar installations. So yeah.
Are these downstate then?
Yeah, for the most part. There's one in Chicago. There's one on the south side of Chicago on a former, I think that one's pretty small though. I think it's only 10 megawatts, but yeah, but more, more on just these big tracts of corn and soybean farms downstate in Illinois.
Another question I wondered about, you mentioned the securitization concept that we have here in Wisconsin to shut down coal plants. How do they do that in Illinois if they're not doing it? How is the risk spread?
Yeah, since in Illinois, since we're deregulated and the utilities aren't billing, the generation is owned separately from the utilities. So the utilities aren't billing the ratepayers directly for the generation. So it'll be private company. Well, I mean, utilities are private too, but companies like NRG and Dynegy that own most of our coal plants. So they're not, and that's actually why, you know, they've been closing at, I think, a faster clip than Wisconsin too, because they're just selling that power on the open market. So they can't bill their costs to ratepayers. So, you know, they're just closing when they can't make a profit anymore. So it is, in that sense, it is a totally different. I mean, that's one way that Illinois has kind of an easier, the people, maybe not the companies, but the people have an easier transition away from coal. There's one municipally owned coal plant in Springfield, and then this Prairie State is like this huge mess where all these towns got like bamboozled into buying the debt, basically buying bonds. So those are like other cases, but for the most part, it's not really an issue there.
So basically it's the companies that are taking the hit then rather
Yeah.
than ratepayers.
Yeah, yeah. And I think they're closing before they take too much of a hit. They're closing the plants, and, you know, they're huge companies that have plenty of reserves. But I mean, yeah, there have been cases, I think it was, if I'm remembering right, where Ameren sold a whole fleet of coal plants to Dynegy, actually at a loss, like if they paid Dynegy to take them off their hands. So yeah, it has been, yeah.
No one else has any
Good
questions?
questions.
What about nuclear in Illinois?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge story. So Exelon, we have this fleet of nuclear plants that provides, I'm forgetting the exact percent, but a huge chunk of our energy. And they've been threatening for at least the past decade to close some of them if they don't get subsidies. So they did get these subsidies in zero emissions credits in that Fija, and then they got more subsidies in Fija that just passed. So, and I mean, we do, you know, it's not like PJM, they're in both PJM and MISO. So, I mean, the reliability, that's like a whole other debate if they're needed for reliability, but it does sound like that power is needed for the time being, and especially to meet our renewable, you know, our carbon-free goals. They are needed according to most people. There's definitely also a movement just saying we don't need them at all and shut them down. And they're not cost effective to run, which is why they are getting the subsidies. And they have Exelon has even now, even after their scandal, immense political power. So that is just a really big, the nuclear is a really big part of Illinois' energy landscape for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
The just transition piece, as part of the leaders of that first coalition in
Yeah.
Chicago, that was over 12 years ago. And when we started that coalition, we were very clear about just transition being part of our goal. And I see how it's so hard to get that done. And I'm curious from your perspective, you know, not just Illinois, not just Wisconsin, but kind of especially Midwest overall, do you see any areas where justice is actually taking off, and what is the secret sauce for that? Because there's such an obvious economic development piece to building renewables, and there's just this block that I'm not understanding why we can't get there. And so I'm curious if you've seen any spaces where it has thrived.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I've been trying to understand that question better, and I have not seen any really great examples of it actually happening. Like in Appalachia is probably leading the way on some really cool ideas and just great effort, more for the coal miners in that case. I mean, it's definitely a growing national movement, and there's, you know, national coalitions and organizations doing all kinds of great planning and like really making tons of demands. But I think the problem comes down to like they're private companies that own the coal plants or the gas or nuclear plants, and, you know, governments, and they really have, like, unless you pass a law like this in Illinois, virtually no responsibility. And even the Illinois law, like as good as it is, I mean, how much concretely it's really going to help any given person in community, you know, might not be that much. So yeah, I mean, you're basically asking, like in Waukegan, they've been demanding for ages that that NRG do stuff to help the community when the coal plant closes, but NRG is basically like, no, that like ignores them. And yeah, and then also just the difficulty, like the transitioning to clean energy jobs. running, obviously, like once you build clean energy stuff, there's not that many jobs in running it, which is in a way part of what's good about it being clean. But yeah, so, and a lot of like, there's been some real depressing stories about programs like trying to teach former coal miners coding or different jobs or helping them start small businesses. And like in most cases, they just don't work. If you've worked at a coal plant or been a coal miner your whole life, like you don't necessarily want to start installing solar panels at probably a lower wage or learn coding or something like that. So I think it's just really, really difficult, and probably is something where just extreme like government subsidies and programs, like even way more ambitious than what's in the Illinois law, like stuff that really just goes beyond what we've ever envisioned, would be the only way to really have a really meaningful. That would be my guess. But people are like you are definitely have been working on it for a long time, and these things take time, obviously. So yeah. Other questions? Right. Well, thank you all. And I'll be curious. Like I said, there's my contact information. If anyone has ideas or any other questions, feel free to contact me, and appreciate it.